elements that are involved in brain function, Debbie. I mean, metals, lithium, rubidium, things you just don't even like think about ever that play a role. But your typical cal, mag, phos, zinc, iron, all the things that make us function at any mitochondrial level in any cell are multiply, that's not a word, multiply important to the brain. I think I need some neurotrophic. Maybe I need a nootropic right now. It's in as many times more mitochondria we have in our brain versus our heart versus our skin. They're that much more important. And this is why we really see decline mentally when we're tired, when we're hungry, when we ate too much sugar, when we're imbalanced. And for me, I don't know. I'm so curious to hear Dr. Davis what you say and Martha. But plasticity to me is so important. The ability of our brain to take in new things, learn new things, and be resilient and adaptable is to me the biggest sign of cognitive youth and longevity.
Martha, what do you have to say with all that?
Well, the microbes, this is my shared passion with Bill, is how important the microbes are to the delivery of the minerals, to all the bioactive compounds they're making, and the importance of specific microbes to making those neurotransmitters. So the health of the microbes and the health of us really depends, though, on those raw materials, which are the minerals. And I'm always showing people this little book. It's like my favorite book. It's 20 years old. It's called The Life Bridge, The Way to Longevity with Probiotic Nutrients. But it essentially shows how microbes transform inorganic matter, which is minerals, into living matter. And the microbes are driving enzymatic action. They're, the one that Bill and I share a great love for is Lactobacillus reuteri, which increases our production of oxytocin. That kind of sits at the top of hormone health. And all of that cascade is very important to cognition, brain health, and healthy aging. So, that's one piece of the puzzle on the healthy brain aging side. The other is, when you have an imbalanced microbiome and say you have an aerobic gut and you're producing, or as Bill talks about a lot, you have SIBO, and there's a large percentage of the population, and I think it's an underappreciated connection with Parkinson's, is you get gram-negative bacteria in the small bowel, and there's a lot of dynamics involved with what those organisms are doing, but they're stealing. That's where you uptake your nutrients. That's where a lot of the action with the food is going on and making those magic metabolites. And so when you get colonic bacteria colonizing your small bowel, they're stealing your nutrients, they're changing that whole terrain, and they're producing endotoxin. And Bill, I've heard Bill talk about endotoxin. This is a big one for me, because as I started to look at it, I mean, endotoxin is one.
Oops.
To create disease. So there's a Parkinson's endotoxin model, there's a diabetes endotoxin model, there's a depression endotoxin model. So, in making sure that we have a healthy gut and that we are anaerobic and that we don't have these endotoxin producing bacteria colonizing our small intestine and stealing our nutrients is very key. But having a nutrient dense diet, or, because we don't have nutrient dense foods, taking a full spectrum mineral, I mean, I'm advertising for the other company, but, putting those raw materials in so that the microbes can do their magic is pretty vital.
I'm glad you
Bill,
brought that up,
yeah.
Martha. That I think that's a hugely underappreciated factor in dementia, Parkinson's disease, and so many other diseases, overweight, type 2 diabetes, coronary disease, atrial fibrillation, rosacea, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, because, the small intestine is so permeable and that endotoxin enters the bloodstream, endotoxemia. And because I'm not affiliated with BiotiQuest, I can toot your horn. And you know that the clinical study you and Raul Cano did showed approaching 100% reduction in endotoxin. That is so fantastic. So think what that had the potential for that. If you could reduce, address the SIBO, of course, but part of that equation is to address the impaired intestinal barrier and reduce endotoxemia. So something like, I don't know if you know what microbe or microbes are responsible for that effect, but the mixture of microbes in the sugar shift is spectacularly effective for reducing endotoxemia.
Thank you, Bill. I think it's the combination that is actually shifting the gut back to an anaerobic environment that's changing and shaping the terrain. So
what I
I
hear
call
you're
it the
saying,
fecalization of America.
yeah.
Sorry, Deb.
No, I was just going to say, Dr. Davis, with the microbes, maybe explain if we can start the conversation so people can understand how is Parkinson's, dementia, Alzheimer's related to our gut health?
Work in progress, right, Martha? A lot of it is the disordered metabolism of microbes invading the small intestine. There may be specific microbes or lack of microbes at play also, like H. pylori may be a player in the stomach. So it's an evolving world. But one thing we do know, endotoxemia is a major driver. So as Martha points out, it's an overgrowth of mostly gram-negative, occasionally gram-positive, Staphylococcus, Enterococcus, Streptococcus in the small intestine, the permeable small intestine. And the important thing here is if you look at all the studies that ask this question, in condition blank, what proportion of people test positive for SIBO? Usually using hydrogen gas as the test. By the way, I don't know if you guys know this, you can do this in your own kitchen or living room with the AIRE device, AIRE, blow into it. There's a prep, and you have to ingest a fiber that microbes can metabolize to hydrogen gas because you can't metabolize hydrogen gas, but microbes can. And then you register if there's a rise of 4 units on a 0 to 10 scale. You've got SIBO. You've got fecal microbes living in your small intestine. So it's real easy. You don't have to get the device to prove whether or not you have it, because what I've been doing, and Martha knows this, if I said, Deb, the solution for SIBO is to surgically remove your small intestine, you should say, hell no, no, you better have a better answer than that. But what if the solution to SIBO is restoring a handful of microbes that have very specific characteristics? They colonize the small intestine, where SIBO occurs, and they produce bacteriocins, natural antibiotics effective in killing fecal microbes. So I have this thing I call SIBO yogurt. We haven't done a clinical trial yet. We will. It's a combination of Lactobacillus reuteri, Lactobacillus gasseri, both small intestine colonizers, bacteriocin producers. I originally used Bacillus coagulans. I replaced it with Bacillus subtilis because subtilis has a broader spectrum of gram-negative, gram-positive bacteriocins. We can co-ferment those three, or you can individually ferment if you want really high numbers, and you consume a half cup of the mixed product or a quarter cup or so of the individual ones. And so far, about 90% of people normalize their SIBO, get rid of their SIBO over about 4 weeks. So I did this just to help people get a little bit of relief from symptoms. I did not expect it would get rid of SIBO in the vast majority of cases.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I love all the strains that you are mentioning. I mean, these have been under study for so long, and there's so many great benefits of these strains that you're both mentioning. But fascinating the feedback that they give to the brain. And I think, Debbie, I think we have to go back to remind listeners, like, there is this super highway that runs from your gut to your brain, and a little donkey trail that runs from the brain to the gut, So when things go wrong in any part of the gut, it really knocks out the brain.
Mm-hmm. The relationship of vagus nerve in there too.
Absolutely. I don't know. I wonder, Martha and Dr. Davis, are you familiar I remember hearing from Dr. David Perlmutter about this study, and it was 2017, I think. It was a Swedish study. It was published in 2017. They tracked patients who had had a truncal vagotomy
Yeah.
for other reasons, like for ulcers. And they tracked them through life, and they showed the distinction between there was an association. It didn't show that you should have a vagotomy to prevent Parkinson's, but it showed that if your vagus nerve was cut where it reached the stomach specifically, I think, if I remember, that when you went through stressors of life and all these other things, there was no feedback to the brain, and there were less incidences of Parkinson's overall in the cohorts in those that had this truncal vagotomy than in those that didn't. And again, it didn't prove that we should all get our vagus nerve cut,
No.
but it proved that when we have poor vagal tone, it feeds back to the brain and can be a contributor to something like Parkinson's.
So there's actually, we're in the process of writing a paper right now with some connections to H. pylori that
Yes.
Bill discussed, but also to the minerals and what's happening with the minerals. So what, of course, people are familiar with H. pylori from ulcers. It also alters the pH of the stomach, so you're not digesting food properly because the pH isn't low enough. But it's also, it goes after the beneficial bacteria. So H. pylori it produces a urease, and there's several other organisms that produce this enzyme called a urease and attack the beneficial microbes in order to get the minerals that it needs, and potassium being one of those. And so what happens is then the beneficial bacteria break open and spill out their potassium. And so you get this flux of potassium that, we see driving changes in the brain and the mitochondria. And so we're kind of in the process of writing up the explanation of that. And there's a big Chinese study of 9,000 Parkinson's patients where they found elevated blood potassium across the board in Parkinson's. And so this imbalance in the gut and, the attack to get the minerals is a really interesting piece of the puzzle. And, potassium's another kind of interesting player for me because I've been looking at the autoimmune connections with Mycobacterium avium paratuberculosis, which is in the milk. And potassium is also a signal for mycobacteria that are latent to come out of latency. So there's just these really interesting mineral and microbe connections that we're just starting to kind of pick at the surface of those. But I think that H. pylori and some of the other SIBO organisms, Desulfo vibrio is another one that was actually identified by a group in Finland who came out with the headline, "This is the cause of Parkinson's." And I'm like, probably not by itself, but it could be a big potential contributor. And, I think some of it is, back to the battle for nutrients. If we're lacking enough nutrient density for ourselves, we're probably lacking enough nutrient density for the microbes. And so we get this battle going on for the limited nutrients that we have.
One of the things that worries me a lot is this idea of so-called bacterial and fungal translocation. That is, bacteria, fungi in one part of the body will take up residence in another part of the body. We know that for a fact. We know, for instance, that Fusobacterium nucleatum, the oral microbe that proliferates in people with bleeding gums or gingivitis or periodontitis, will, via the bloodstream, take up residence in the colon. And the evidence is pretty good. That is a major driver of colon cancer. How about that's a negative thing, but there's also positive. If a woman takes Lactobacillus crispatus, it will colonize the vagina, which is crazy. There's no connection that we know of, right? And then even more remarkable, it will colonize the bladder. What the hell? Is it just because it's nearness, contiguity in the perineum and in the groin area? But this is a great thing because a woman can take Crispatus. Many ladies have lost it, and it's the dominant microbe meant to be of a healthy vaginal microbiome. But she can take it orally and will colonize vagina, reduce risk of dryness, irritation, infection, including candida infection, and reduce the frequency of urinary tract infections by about half, and reduce incontinence, which is fantastic. But the thing I worry about with regard to brain health is a major occupant of the brain in people with dementia and Parkinson's is Porphyromonas gingivalis and Fusobacterium nucleatum, oral microbes. Or how about Candida species? You know, Ruth Alonso's data from Spain, where she sectioned people's brains. Young people who die in car accidents, no fungi. Older people who die of other reasons, few fungi. People who die of dementia, filled with fungus. Now, does that prove cause and effect? No, not yet. That's a tough study to do. But what do we do about that? So in other words, what I'm thinking is happening is we've got to manage the holobiome. You got to address the oral microbiome. You got to address the vaginal microbiome. You got to address the airway microbiome. You got to address the gastrointestinal microbiome, the nasal. How do you do it? Work in progress, don't know. Because if you have fungi in your brain, where do they come from? Some would say from the sinuses. What about the gastrointestinal tract? Well, that's true. Is eradication of fungi or reduction of Candida species, say, or Malassezia in the colon and small bowel, is that sufficient to turn off the repository that may have seeded your brain? Don't know.
Well,
It's amazing.
There is a connection with, or a correlation with Malassezia and the scalp seborrheic.
Oh, really?
With Parkinson's. There's some papers on that. But I've looked at the oral microbiome quite a bit related to Parkinson's as well. And I'm just wondering, Amber, do people ever use the Beam Minerals as a mouthwash? I mean, it just kind of occurred to me. It's like, maybe you should be doing a mouthwash.
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is part of Caroline, the founder, of her story and her periodontal disease and gingivitis. The level of inflammation that was in her mouth that improved when she started taking the minerals, not, maybe because she's swallowing it and then they're coming back out, but also because they're passing through the mouth. And that was one of the things. She started swishing with it. I do that as well. Every part of your digestive tract, from the sinuses, all the way down and out, that is all gastrointestinal. That's all microbiome. Your skin is a microbiome. Your eyes are a microbiome. Your scalp is a microbiome. In between your toes is a microbiome. And your groin is a microbiome. And your armpit is a microbiome. So yes, I want to tie something together for both of you, Martha and Dr. Davis, that is just where Beam minerals aren't just any mineral. They're fulvic and humic mineral complexes, which are technically a postbiotic from microorganisms 65 million years ago.
Yep.
They are not just any mineral. They are minerals that are connected to fulvic and humic, which are made by microorganisms when they decompose plant matter. And every living thing, including us, and we don't like to think about this when we're born, it's a balance between the microorganisms that break us down and the ones that build us up. And you talk about fungus being all up inside of people with dementia. They're dying while they're alive. And they're not the only ones. Cancer patients, very much a relationship with that. There's so many things that are related to that. And it's always, there's no killing one microbe without affecting the ecosystem, right? And there's no feeding one microbe without affecting the ecosystem of all of them. And so how do we live in balance with this? We have a provider for Beam Minerals in Switzerland, and he has had his experiences with Lyme. And what you feed yourself, you're feeding that Lyme microorganism. And so we have to understand that, yes, it is all going to everything. And how, we are all electrical, and getting the right mineral replenishment at the cellular level, the mitochondrial level, determines our electrical conduction, and the brain is all electrical conduction. And so if your wires are all gummed up, like happened in my tractor the other day, when it all got burned and melted together, the tractor doesn't run, right? And neither does the brain.
Have you guys had a chance to review the red light data visible red, infrared, for cognitive health?
Surely not nearly as much as you.
Well, Amber, I'm relatively new to this conversation. I thought it was BS, but then I had a personal experience where I replaced all my home's lights with blue LED, like they tell us to save energy, right? And that's true. And I noticed I could barely see at night on my screen.
Mhm.
So I wondered if it was blue. So I exchanged my LED blue with incandescent, old-fashioned incandescent that gives off red and infrared. And my vision normalized within 48 hours. And I said,
I
what?
believe you.
So I looked through that data. Yeah, blue light damages your eyes. It
That's
damages.
why
Yep,
that's why I
yep,
have these.
yep. Uh-huh.
And they make a
So,
tremendous difference, even outside.
mm-hmm. Uh,
Well,
but the
it
red, so there's one animal experiment where they took red light. In this case, I think it was a mixture of red wavelength, red, visible red and infrared. They showed it on the backs of mice, backs, not on the head, not on the eyes, on the backs. And they sectioned their brains, so control and then red light exposure. And it was a dementia model. And all beta amyloid plaque and phosphorylated tau, of course, the hallmarks of dementia, disappeared. Disappeared. And now there's no such human data. Amber says we can't biopsy her brain, so we have to
Just
go by
me.
some other measure. So it has been done in cognitively impaired people, red light. In this case, I believe it was to the head and also nasal, and there was another part of the body. And they actually had improvement in cognitive measures. So there's presumptive or early evidence that red light, though I remind people, my audience always goes berserk. They want to spend $3,000 on some red light. No, 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 no. Just go
what in
outside.
the sun?
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Yes, we forget that that early morning light is that, and it is to prepare us for the stronger light during the day when we're out farming or whatever we're supposed to be doing. We forget that it is out there. And if you're afraid of the sun, and I mean, that's a whole other thing, but early morning light is that red light. It has the right wavelengths. And if you keep anything in the dark and in moisture, what grows on it?
Mold. Well,
Yeah.
on the light front, there's an interesting, it's a it's hard to find the original episode, but Radiolab has they have an episode called Bringing Gamma Back. And it's actually about the MIT research where they originally started out by drilling holes in the mouse and putting light into directly into the brain. And then they were like, okay, well, that's not going to fly anywhere. And so then they, I think, put them in a box that was dark, and they did a pulsed gamma wave light at 40 hertz for an hour, and 50% of the beta amyloid disappeared within an hour. And so there, that light frequency is, and of course, we talked about this a little when you came and talked to my group, Bill, about microbes and light. And that was an early kind of piece of the puzzle in the Parkinson's data I was looking at is there was an enzyme involved in photosynthesis basically there. And I called up Jack Gilbert and I was like, is there light in the gut? He's like, there's no light in the gut. And then I started looking, I was like, there is light in the gut. And microbes make light in the gut. And I've gone on to figure out a lot more, the three aromatic amino acids fluoresce. They make light. And they're disrupted by glyphosate, which damages the bifidobacteria and the lactobacillus. And bifidobacteria, I just learned last week, they have they fluoresce something like 5,000 times more light than a lot of the other microbes and eukaryotes, us. Yeah. So pretty
Incredible.
interesting, the light component that I think people are just starting to pick at the surface. But there's a microbial connection, and then of course there's a mineral connection because you can't turn on the light without the raw materials that provide the spark for the energy.
That, yes, that phosphorus is a huge part of that. Incredible.
So just to take a pause to back up and understand the why, how do things get so broken? as we're talking about SIBO and H. pylori and just dysbiosis, poor balance in our microbes of the good bacteria to the bad bacteria, that we have mineral imbalances. But work above that, what do you find impacts our brain health starting north, or our environment, and how we get to have cognitive decline if we don't take ownership of our health now? Anyone?
Diet's a big player. We haven't talked about that. I would say any diet that involves raising blood glucose and or generates insulin resistance. So as you guys know, insulin resistance can occur in the brain. Um, when that occurs, your brain can't get glucose. And that's why there's some evidence that taking MCTs, for instance, or ketones can bypass some of the cognitive impairment in people who have insulin resistance because glucose can't enter the brain, so you provide an alternative source of energy. But I would say it's twofold. Insulin resistance that deprives the brain of glucose, and glycation, that is glucose modification of proteins, neuronal or glial proteins. They are, like many other proteins in the body, very glycation prone. And when that happens, it turns them into gunk, essentially.
Like fried
So,
chicken.
so, of course, we live in a world where we've been told cut your fat, cut your saturated fat, eat more healthy whole grains, and everything in moderation, which is a formula for disaster because that ensures that you will be fat and diabetic and have dementia later in life.
That's a great place to start, Dr. Davis, because you just said it. Like there's advice that came through to people that went contradictive to everything that humans ever did. Even, I mean, we can look at primal humans, we can look at the blue zones. I prefer to look at the blue zones because modern day today, you've got people living in to be 100 years old and still cognitively sharp in areas of Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia, Italy, Icaria, Greece, Nicoya, Costa Rica. And it's not necessarily that they're on any special diet, but they eat real food. They don't eat prepackaged food. They don't overdo any one thing. And then they have the other lifestyle factors, right? Of movement, social connectedness, purpose. They might have access to really good water. Some of them drink wine, some of them don't. Some of them eat rice, some of them don't. Some of them eat corn, some of them don't. There's no one diet, but it's all real food. And this whole business, I mean, I remember the 90s because I tried everything as a nutritionist, man. I was N=1. So I tried the whole low fat craze. Well, we're going to have ice cream with no fat, cake with no fat, cookies with no fat. What goes in there instead? Nothing but chemicals. My uncle passed away of dementia. He was in his 80s, but he used to get non-fat Alfredo sauce. And I'm just like, well, what is it then?
Father.
Is that microplastic with garlic? Like, what is that?
Martha, what have you found with your Parkinson's research on why do people, the trends or patterns with people that are getting Parkinson's to not with their lifestyle nutrition?
We're actually working on a documentary right now as part of a Parkinson's meeting that I'm having in May, and Bill's actually coming to that. But one of the real epiphanies for me, I'm sorry, I have tried to get that dinger to turn off, is the connection to stress.
Yes.
And I think that is really underappreciated. And we've been gathering people's stories. Tell me your story before you got Parkinson's. What was your life? And the stress events in these people's lives and the connections to either a low grade chronic stress over a long period of time or a really major emotional stressor that gets locked inside because you're not supposed to cry or you're not supposed to feel and these our mental state affects our microbes. I mean that John Cryan and Ted Dinan have a book called Psychobiotic Revolution, and they're really the pioneers of microbes and psychiatry and our emotional state. But there is a deep interconnection with our emotions and how we feel and what that does in the body to the microbes. And then, you can get these vicious loops of anxiety and stress. And so that is a really huge underappreciated piece of the puzzle that's never addressed by or never even nobody ever asks a question about that. And so I wonder if starting to understand how these stressors early on in life and learning to address those might actually turn some people back from ever getting something like Parkinson's because they're not under that chronic stress. And what does chronic stress do? It burns magnesium like crazy. So, and you're burning up, you're burning up minerals. It burns up glucose. So it burns up glucose and probably is, a contributor to the insulin resistance to the brain. And blue light burns up glucose. So, in the last 20 years, we're bombarded with blue light, we're bombarded with stress, we're bombarded with glucose and fructose. And so, we see this rising curve. It's probably a combination of those factors.
It brings it back, Debbie, to what you wanted to talk about, which is vagal nerve and vagal tone. And this is a very genetic dependent, like people who just have an innate better vagal tone and might have a better outcome, and those that suffer more from stress. But it can't be understated to just bring it down to a listener level. Cars pass us, like we're going 55 and they're going 55. Isn't that 110? I don't remember my physics. I think that's 110 miles an hour. A car goes past you. This is stressful. Take somebody from a place where there are no cars and do that to them and see how they respond. See the fear that they have. We are constantly running from wild animals, something our ancestors did not do. They had rest in between, and everything. You didn't get it. I'm reading audibly the book called The Invisible Rainbow, the history of electricity. And it has to do with what's inside our cells, which are inside our brain. It has to do with all of this pollution of frequency, starting with the dang telegram.
Yeah.
That long ago, the great flu epidemic was related to electricity and what it does to our bodies. When we're sick, we don't conduct electricity. So if we can restore conduction, the body can actually heal. So the stress, thank you for bringing it back around to that. It is, you cannot ignore that. And what it does to our brain, it does many more times to our gut. And now you've started a cycle that is really hard to intercept.
Have you guys seen this? When somebody has SIBO/endotoxemia or fungal overgrowth, whether it's colonic or SIFO, small intestinal fungal overgrowth, that it seems to be coupled with hatred, anger, frustration. I think it's a consequence of stress, as Martha points out. And then it leads to these adverse behaviors, racism, violence, and that it seems to get toned back when you address those things, and even better when you restore Reuteri presumptively for its oxytocin effect, and maybe reduction endotoxemia as well. But I'm seeing major shifts in behavior, human behavior, so much so that all future clinical trials were coupling every effort with well-being questionnaires.
It's a great idea.
That's what I find. Everything I always work backwards, and how when we spoke, Dr. Davis, about SIBO, and Martha and I were going into SIBO and H. pylori, but how do we get it? Keep going deeper, working the way up north, and it comes to why do we have some of us get more health problems? It seems to come back to chronic stress externally and accumulation of internal sources over time, as we say as FDN practitioners, metabolic chaos. Then I always look at, okay, well, then what's causing that imbalance? And it always comes back to me looking at the vagus nerve and how that interacts with all those functions and how that connects with the next area I want to dive into, leaky gut and the gut brain connection, leaky gut leading to leaky brain. So does anyone want to connect any of that and their thoughts on, we were talking about the glycolics layer and how a leaky gut can cause a leaky brain, can lead to all these cognitive health issues?
Well, one thing I see ladies blow off is of all crazy things, hyaluronic acid. So if I say to a woman, hey, You ought to be taking hyaluronic acid. She says, oh, no, I pay a whole bunch of money for a hyaluronic acid serum. I put it right here. And it reduced my wrinkles. So I asked him, what did it do for the wrinkles on your neck or your abdomen? Nothing, of course. So it's the magic of hyaluronic acid, of course, is ingested orally. But it's absent from modern diet because we don't eat brain or skin or tongue anymore.
Or
And
too
so
much broth.
we lead a hyaluronic acid deprived lifestyle, and we forgot that hyaluronic acid is a fiber. It's one of the very rare fibers sourced from animals. Most fibers from plants, of course. This is from animals, and it is spectacular in blooming beneficial species, particularly butyric acid producing species, so-called butyrogenic species. So if you get hyaluronic acid orally, most people don't want to eat brain or skin anymore, so as a supplement, right? You bloom Akkermansia, Faecalibacterium, Ruminicaceae, Lactospiraceae. You reduce proteobacteria, the gram-negatives, the fecal microbes, and you increase mucus production. So hyaluronic acid, this incredibly neglected fiber, is spectacular for shifting, not by itself. You want to do other things as well, but it adds to the effect of reducing unhealthy microbes, proliferating healthy microbes, and even improving the intestinal barrier.
Well,
Well,
Bill, now I know what to do with the 7 extra roosters I have.
And smoother skin and better joints.
And
well, hyaluronic acid is one of the main components of the glycocalyx. And it's a sulfated polymer that, like, most people have probably never heard of, but it is. And in the earlier discussions, people thought that the glycocalyx was the lining of the blood vessels. Well, it is the lining of the blood vessels, but it's a lot more than that. It's the lining of every cell in the body, every member, every tissue, the blood-brain barrier, the whole shooting match. That is what protects us. So that, and it has these long polymers that stick out. So that's the endothelial surface layer that's coming out from the glycocalyx. And then you have the glycocalyx, and you have these little nanobubbles of oxygen and nitrogen crossing over into the blood, and then carbon dioxide coming back the other way. And it's a really underappreciated system of how that's working. But if those tiny little nanobubbles collapse, the glycocalyx collapses and you lose your protective layer. And so, part of what's going on is all of these, different debris and chemicals and things that are having an effect on that primary barrier, is allowing lots of things to cross over into the bloodstream, into the brain, into a lot of areas that should be privileged and protected, and they're not. And that's an emerging area of research, but Dr. Hans Vink is really the pioneer in that, and has I mean, he's taken images of the glycocalyx and endothelial surface layer in the body, and in live motion, and it's really remarkable work when you start to look at that and think about it. And so, there are things that you can do to repair it, and hyaluronic acid is part of that. That's also why some of the bone broths help, collagen, and you can't build those structures again without the raw materials, microorganisms and the raw materials to do it.
Right. I don't think of our listeners know, and I'm the supplement geek, so I'll bring to light, like, hyaluronic acid is sourced for supplements and for skincare, either from things like the comb of the rooster, that's my rooster joke, or from microbial fermentation. And that's when you see sodium hyaluronate. That's from microbial fermentation. So again, it always comes back to a healthy microbiome. And are you able to make it, or do you get it from animal products? If you don't eat animal products, you're probably not getting it. And my question as a nutritionist is always, well, what would be the natural equivalent for this? And as you both mentioned, eating parts of animals that we tend to wrinkle our nose at, and even if we look at cultures around the world that consume very large. They consume the whole animal. So if it was a chicken, they eat it 2 days and then it goes in the soup pot, right? If it was a fish, they eat it and then it goes in the soup pot. And we get all of these extra nutrients from throwing the rest of it in the soup pot. If I have lamb and I process it, all the bones, I'm gonna boil it down and it's gonna be in a soup pot. And this is the whole chicken soup is good for the soul, right?
Yeah.
This wasn't just folk medicine. There's plenty of parts of chickens that have been proven to be very beneficial, each of them isolated and studied. And here again is another example. So if you're vegan or vegetarian or just don't like to eat animal products, you've got to really look into whether the microbially fermented version is successful.
Yeah. Stone soup is another old folk tale that's another great
Yes,
example of that.
that's a community
Everybody's
story.
just throwing in their stuff, but it's often like some of the recipes from Sally Fallon's cookbook, Nourishing Traditions.
Totally.
Like there's a potassium broth, I think, and you're putting the potato peels in there. And what do people do? They peel the peel off the carrot or the potato, but that's often where a lot of those nutrients are. But
Yeah.
My pig gets all that potassium. He must be replete with potassium. Maybe he has too much potassium, like I've seen in some. I think you were talking about that a minute ago, Dr. Bill.
Yeah.
So what are
there's
some
basic
solutions?
stuff.
Yeah.
Sorry,
go
there's
ahead.
basic stuff we haven't talked about, like omega-3 fatty acids. That is a neurotrophic, and of course, it's absent from most people's diets. Um, it's the DHA, of course, mostly DHA. It makes me laugh because I see these idiotic pharma people hawking the Visipa for reduction of cardiovascular events, which is 4,000 milligrams of the EPA alone. So if you take Visipa for cardiovascular health, but you want cognitive health, you have to go out and buy fish oil to supplement your Visipa.
Right.
That is the logic of
Ridiculous.
pharma.
Well, and Visipa has also been shown because it's taking one thing in isolation in very high amounts. Now we're seeing arrhythmias and other problems. And I mean, it comes back to this glycocalyx and this concept of turbulence also, and the damage that turbulence does. Look what happens when the space shuttle, shakes upon leaving or entering the atmosphere. Look what damage it does. You think this doesn't happen in your brain, in your blood vessel, that sharp objects such as unbound metals and free radicals aren't causing damage constantly? I mean, the inside of our bodies looks like, the extra the space around the Earth where we have all this junk floating
Debris.
around. You can't, the debris that's orbiting our planet, and it's getting to where you can't leave the planet without risking, a collision. And this is what is happening inside of our bodies. The glycated proteins. Oh my goodness. I mean, this is something that we've known about for so long, right, Dr. Bill? And yet I think that the average person doesn't. I mean, that's a big word. Let's break it down for people. What does that do? What is it? Where does it come from?
It's great. Nobody here is a mainstream practicing MD. That's why you know so much. Because if you're a mainstream practicing MD, you don't know shit. You don't know.
Your brain is taken up with pharmaceuticals that you have to memorize.
I mean, in what world is that okay? Where the presumed experts are not experts at all. If your car didn't start, and you take to the mechanic, and he says, "Hey, I don't know what to do. I can put a new engine in." You say, "Wait, aren't you the expert?" Of course, he would know what to do. But why are the mainstream physicians completely in the dark? I'm generalizing, of course, but about these kinds of things. So if you went to a fancy pants neurologist at, who knows, Columbia University, Mayo Clinic, whatever, and you said, "Hey, how do I prevent dementia? My dad had it when he was 78, and I'm 60. I want to prevent." They say, well, everything in moderation. Take a multivitamin. They give you nonsense. They don't
do some Sudoku.
Right. So, yeah, we should talk about that. All the evidence that there's some kind of cognitive reserve in people who are more educated or learn a new skill like chess or French or Spanish later in life, or a new instrument. Of course, that's observational data, and there's selection bias at work in these things. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. There's no proof that it does work. That's all observational. And so I tell that because people say, "I'm going to learn a new language, learn how to play trumpet and piano." And maybe do Sudoku. Maybe it helps, but there's no evidence that it does.
Well, which
We don't
countries
know
have the
really.
highest rates of dementia?
Pardon me?
Developed or developing? Which countries have the highest rates of dementia?
Oh, of course, us. Yeah.
Developed.
Right. So
Mhm.
how does that go together? That doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
You go and get on a boat in Vietnam and eat some of the food that they're eating, you're not going to find it to the
Mhm.
levels that you see it here.
So,
So
back
go
to
ahead,
your
Martha.
question about what is glycation,
Yes,
so there
please
are
answer that.
enzymatic and non-enzymatic reactions. And Bill, you tell me if I get this wrong, but glycation is basically non-enzymatic browning of sugars. And so it goes back again to not having a working enzyme production, which goes all the way back to the microbes in terms of, because I mean, let's face it, we're made of sugar. You know,
Well, women are. We know
deoxyribose
that.
is a sugar. But if we are not properly, making the glycans and the things that like copper that goes to the brain in a glycosylated anchor, which is a sugar. If you can't make those properly because you don't have the enzymatic reactions and the sort of microbial base to do it, then you start getting a lot of these non-enzymatic metabolites. And that's not just glycated sugars. You get it with like there are some melanins that are non-enzymatic or Amadori products that come from not having, say, the tyrosinase enzyme that works properly. So there's a lot of different things in the body where there's a backup output that comes from the non-enzymatic reaction versus the enzymatic reaction. And the enzymatic reaction is typically the one that you want. That wasn't a great
Well,
explanation.
I'd say basically people are making either donuts or fried chicken wings in their bloodstream, and that's not the place that you want it.
That's a much better explanation.
And it comes down again to diet and digestive capacity. Okay, because we all know that people aren't digesting their food properly, whether it's the food or the digestion. Stress impedes digestion, and the poorer your digestion, the worse your stomach acid, the higher pH in your stomach. It needs to be low. The less that you're able to break down your proteins and fats, the less minerals that you have. The less minerals you have, the less your enzymes work, period, and any chemical reaction in your body. Even your digestive enzymes coming from the pancreas, once things reach your small intestine, you're not going to have as many because they're proteins, or they're not going to work because that's minerals. And you're not going to break your food down, which means you're not going to get properly broken down and compartmentalized sugars, fats that are properly broken down and not oxidized, proteins that are properly broken down into the right peptide lengths, minerals that are properly broken down into their ionic form for absorption. Not only are we wasting so much food in the toilet, so much nutrition in the toilet, of the nutrition that's even in the food that we eat, but we're not even absorbing it in to be utilized, and it perpetuates this cycle. So it's not just that the food in the ground doesn't have the nutrients that we need. It's that the type of food that we're consuming and what we've done to it is wrong. The stress is causing our digestive capacity to be limited and minimized. And so this creates this vicious cycle of continued poor nutrient status for all of these very fancy words that you just mentioned, Martha. You two are like such big brains. I'm going to try to bring it down to like the KFC version.
Great
Yeah,
analogy.
that's great.
No,
I was actually just starting to read the Minnesota starvation study. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Ansel Keys, most people know who he is because he's the guy who
Right.
sent us away from fat. But apparently, he was also one of the masterminds of the Minnesota starvation study. And that's a study essentially that they studied conscientious objectors in World War II and put them on a very low calorie diet, but also a very nutrient deprived diet. And there were all these downstream effects, including lifelong effects, because they went back and studied some of them later in terms of their behavior and relationship with food, their ability to metabolize certain kinds of food, all of these kind of different pieces of the puzzle that if you look at that in the context, I can't believe I haven't said this yet on this talk, but in the context of glyphosate in our food supply, and you look at how it has depleted the nutrients in our foods, because that's what it does. It chelates and binds minerals. You couldn't think of a better way than the widespread use of glyphosate in the food system to make a population who is suffering from high calorie malnutrition.
Well
Dr.
said.
Davis, anything to add or thoughts on
Just
any of
a
this?
simple idea. I'll remind listeners that if you're worried about this process Martha's talking about, and what I call endogenous glycation, you just get a hemoglobin A1C and tells you whether you're glycating or not. Though, don't listen to the doctor who says, "Oh, your hemoglobin A1C is 5.7. You're fine."
Thank you.
Translation: you don't need metformin or
Yet.
Byetta, or insulin. You're okay.
Come
Not
back in 3 months. We'll get you on
medication.
it.
Mm-hmm. So we're aiming for 5.0 or less because glycation begins at about 4.9 or 5.0. And that means glycation of small LDL that leads to heart disease, glycation of neuronal proteins leads to dementia. So it's a big deal. And you have a very readily cheap test you can do. A hemoglobin A1C tells you whether you're glycating or not.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about nutrition. We talked about chronic stress. We didn't really mention sleep, but what about alcohol before? I know we're going to run out of time, but
Oh,
anything
Debbie,
on
stop
alcohol?
it now. You stop it now.
Because
I
people
like my
think,
glass of wine.
I know everyone likes that. I don't drink that much, but I've seen patterns of all these people that are having dementia, cognitive decline, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's in my parents' age range, and
But
people
not in
passing away.
Sardinia and not in
Well, I know.
Ikaria
Yeah,
and not in
why can they drink?
Okinawa.
So
Why
is
is
it not
that?
alcohol? Is combination? Alcohol's fine, no brain.
It's not fine. What is the source? What is the context?
Mm-hmm.
What else goes along with it? What is the rest of your diet? What does it do to your sleep? What does it do to your stress? I mean, if it's a question between being totally stressed out and getting running all over the place, being totally stressed out, getting a really good takeout meal so that I can stay up until 1 in the office and work, but I don't drink alcohol. Or coming home and having a well-balanced home-cooked meal from animals I raised on the farm and a glass of wine and relaxing. Contextually, I need to choose the latter.
I like Danbert's philosophy.
Mm-hmm. So it's a combination
Heavy
of
drinking,
how
of
we're having
course, is a problem. There's no question about that.
It's a
But the
neurotoxin.
kind of light drinking Amber's talking about, I think it's really overblown. I think it's perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It does introduce changes.
Microbes can break down alcohol too. So I think a lot of that also plays into what kind of microbiome you have, and does it have alcohol dehydrogenase capability? And I think there actually is a company that sells a product based on that, but I'll tell you that, the microbes in our sugar shift also have alcohol dehydrogenase, so we don't
Now
sell it.
you've sold it. Bring me. I'm going to send you my address.
You can have a glass of wine and a pill of sugar shift and you won't have a headache. So
well, straight alcohol, distilled alcohol, it doesn't have a lot of phytonutrients in it, and so that's good for some people if they're going to drink alcohol, but it's terribly damaging to your microbes. Why do we use rubbing alcohol to clean a wound, right? So you have to realize that when it goes down your gullet, especially if you don't have food in there, that's just not taking care of yourself. And does your alcohol have you, or do you have that alcohol? Do you have that glass of wine in your hand, or does that wine have you?
Mm-hmm.
Every time we start to use something, expecting a particular benefit or result or coping from it, it has us. And this is always the slippery slope. It's always the question.
I am going to have to say something about sleep, though, because that also goes back to the glycocalyx, and we didn't talk about lymph, but the glymph system, that's when you're taking out your trash. And there's a lot of connection with sleep disruption. People who have REM sleep disorder often go on to develop Parkinson's. And the ability to sleep well so that you're able to take the trash out of the brain is really, really critical. And back to the light for a moment, blue light in the evening is going to disrupt your sleep patterns and make you not sleep as well. So good sleep hygiene and, taking those steps to watch the sunrise, watch the sunset, set your circadian clock, try to, as much as possible, get rid of the blue light in the evening, get yourself a pair of the crazy orange shades, and really practice good sleep hygiene in order to get your body back in a rhythm where it can take out the trash while you're sleeping. I like to equate it. I'm kind of a Star Trek fan with if anybody's a
Me
Star Trek,
too.
Seven of Nine, she had this little pod she went into to recharge herself. And that's what our sleep is our recharging pod.
Recharge. Yeah.
I'm a chronic insomniac, terrible. With Reuteri, I sleep straight through 8, 9 hours.
Yeah.
I added Lactobacillus casei shirota. That's the Yakult product, but fermented as yogurt. So we get higher counts, like 300 billion per serving. And I was sleeping, as a chronic insomniac, I was sleeping 12 hours a night. I had to stop it because you and I have things to do. We can't be sleeping 12 hours a night. Another one is lactobacillus ferment. And we're learning all this anecdotally because there's no such study. And anecdotally, via graphic devices, Apple Watch or a Ring, Fitbit, all that stuff, we're seeing a lengthening of REM with all this stuff. A complete opposite of what, say, narcotics or benzodiazepines do, which is abbreviate REM and erode your sleep. So we're getting some really cool lessons, though it's all coming out anecdotally.
Well, I wanted to ask you guys each individually to share, what do you feel is coming out? Anything new on cognitive health research? Where is it heading? Nothing new? Any focus areas?
What I would say
Microbiome.
is the paradigms of science and our research frameworks are pretty much wrong. So whatever's coming out on the current frontier is based on foundational pieces of science that are actually not correct. And so you're never going to get to the right answer without a proper foundation. And that's actually part of what our Parkinson's meeting in May is about, the foundations, including the glycocalyx, but the foundations of science that are missing from the framework and are well documented and should be well known across the research and are not. And so we're still doing research in these old paradigms that are wrong. So I'm going to say there's nothing exciting because it's all based on old stuff.
I think one thing is clear. The answer for dementia is not going to come from pharma because, as Martha points out, they're barking up the wrong tree. Antibodies against beta amyloid plaque, really? Give me a break. That doesn't work. That's nonsense. Oh, but it's going to cost thousands of dollars a month for a drug that doesn't do anything. I think the solution is going to be in all the things we've talked about, addressing endotoxemia, addressing heavy metals. We haven't talked about that. Nutrition, omega-3 fatty acids, insulin resistance, glycation, the oral microbiome. In other words, there's no pill. It's when you think about it, it's so ridiculous that you can take a pill or an antibody and that will cure dementia. Of course, that's ridiculous. You have to address all the varied factors that take you down that path.
And it's the whole system. We are a system, and it's all about that terrain and the lifestyle. And we're more microbial than we are human. So
we're an ecosystem.
Yeah, we've got to
everything has to interact.
Yeah, that we are work together in balance. It can't be this it's like playing ping pong right now.
Or like when you get 3 or 4 balls in the pinball machine when it reaches that upper level and they're just all bouncing into each other.
Exactly.
All right. What is one thing that you do for yourself to improve your cognitive health?
Did we lose you, Deb?
Yeah. Okay. Got it. I know my Wi-Fi is being weird. You guys hear me? One thing that's a non-negotiable for you to improve your cognitive health. Anyone have something they
Address SIBO
do?
and endotoxemia.
Is that what you do for your health? For you personally, what are you working on?
Oh, me?
Mm-hmm.
To me, SIBO and SIFO are ongoing battles. So I moved about 2 years ago and I got a rip-roaring case of both. It was very stressful moving. So I dread moving. So, but it speaks to Martha's point that is stress a major driver of these things. And so managing stress, but dealing with the consequences, but specifically SIBO, SIFO.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, for me, it has been really focusing on real food, nutrient dense food. And, I have a pretty simple, I don't take a lot of supplements, but like Bill said, I take fish oil. So I know that's demonized by a lot of people, but I take fish oil. I take a glycocalyc support product called Revasca. I take my sugar shift. I make Rooterai yogurt with Bill's product, and I take the bean minerals. And that's kind of pretty much it. I'll periodically, oh, and I do take a copper supplement called Recuperate. And that's it. I guess that was a few things, but it all is around the gut ecosystem and the nutrient density and minerals.
And I'm
Amber, do
probably
you
going
have,
to lose you in a minute,
yeah,
but I'm
you're
going to try
driving.
to pause right here while I've got a little signal.
Sorry.
My sleep is non-negotiable. So anything that interferes with my sleep is out.
Mm.
You know, don't be afraid to really value your sleep. And I'm finding, I was just at the Health Optimization Summit. I'm finding that my vagal tone was incredible. And I don't think it's anything special. I think partly my genetics, but it's also that I sleep and I have certain stress management techniques, and they're not great. I've been absolutely out of my mind in the last year. I mean, lost it. But I have abilities to come back, and sleep is it. I mean, literally, if you're struggling one day, if you're over sugared, if you're overstimulated, if you're over alcohol, if you're just over whatever, too much of anything, go to bed, push reset.
Mm-hmm.
You do it to your phone, you do it to your computer, you do it. Why?
Agreed.
You're electrical. Push the
Yeah.
reset button and do whatever you need to do to help yourself. I mean, we didn't even cover it, but everybody who mentioned it, sleep is numero uno.
Mm-hmm. For me too. That's my big
Yeah,
thing.
I would also add that I walk outside every day. I walk about 3.5 to 4 miles a day on my farm. And so I'm out without any electronics, without any people, without anything. I'm just out in nature for, 45 minutes every day.
Good practice.
That is good. Well, I appreciate everyone's
Hug a
time.
twin. Hugging ducklings helps.
Oh, yeah, hugging animals.
Hug
So,
your lambs, hug your doggies. What?
yeah, animal connection with humans too, though. I just feel that's a big part of
I lost
the
you guys
blue
for a moment.
zones. Yeah, the blue
Yep,
zones
I
you're
think
talking
Debbie's
about, just
frozen.
human connection.
And
I know.
Anna's kind of frozen. It looks like it's you and me, Bill.
I hear you.
I guess we right, huh?
All right. So, where can everyone find you if my internet keeps going out today? But
Oh, Deb's
Oh,
back.
there she is. Oh,
where do
Maybe
you
not.
want to send
are you
everyone?
back, Debbie?
Yeah, can you hear
Oh.
me?
Now we can.
I don't know what's wrong with my internet, but where do you want to send people to learn more about how to improve their future self?
Well, for me, if you have Parkinson's, I write about Parkinson's on my Martha's Quest blog. That's marthasquest.com. The probiotics you can find at BiotiQuest.com. So that's BiotiQuest.com.
Great. And Dr. Davis, we know everyone knows where you are too, but want to say where do you want to send people to learn more? Yeah.
Well, that's one of the products I formulated. My Rotary or Gut to Glow is the skin formulation that combines other things. My blog is williamdavismd.com. And I have a membership website also. Like tonight, we're gonna do 2 hours, two-way Zoom. That's innercircle.drdavesinfinitehealth.com.
Yes, I'll put that in the show notes. And Amber?
And I don't know,
Debbie,
Amber's
It's
frozen.
minerals.
All right.
I think she's frozen.
Am I frozen? Beminerals.com.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. I appreciate all your research and continuing to help us all be healthy from the inside out.
Frozen,
Yeah.
Debbie.
I don't know why I'm frozen, but
Thanks,
thank you
guys.
for
Nice to talk to
helping
you.
us all.
Bye-bye.